The Blackwood Mill had stood on the banks of the Athabasca River for 31 years, and in all that time, no woman had ever set foot inside the cutting floor. That was the rule Cornelius Blackwood, 58 years old, had kept since the day he inherited the place from his father. Not out of cruelty, not even out of stubbornness. It was simply the way things were done in Hinton, Alberta, in the years after the war, when a man's word was his deed, and his deed was his legacy. Cornelius ran 400 acres of timber lease, employed 62 men, and had a reputation that stretched from Edmonton down to Calgary. A man who had never once missed a payroll, never once broken a contract, and never once asked anyone for anything he wasn't prepared to give back double. He had built all of it alone. His wife, Mary, had died of fever 17 years ago when their son was still a boy. After that, Cornelius buried himself in the work. The mill became his church. The timber became his prayer. And the river, wide and cold and indifferent, became the only companion he trusted. He was not, by any definition, a man who needed saving, which is exactly why what happened in the autumn of 1953 surprised everyone in Hinton, except, perhaps, the people who caused it. The Sutcliffe family had been in the lumber business almost as long as the Blackwoods. Almost. That word, almost, was the wound that had never fully healed for Douglas Sutcliffe, 61, who sat every Sunday at the same pew in the same church as Cornelius and smiled the way men smile when they are planning something. Douglas had 2 sons and a daughter. The sons, Preston, 34, and Harvey, 31, ran the Sutcliffe operation with the kind of loud confidence that comes from never having earned anything. They cut corners. They underpaid their crews. They lost 3 contracts in 2 years to Blackwood Mill, each one a humiliation Douglas catalogued like a man keeping score. The daughter was different. Meredith Sutcliffe was 24 years old and had spent the better part of her life being the quietest person in any room her family occupied. She had her mother's gray eyes and her grandfather's head for numbers. She had studied bookkeeping in Edmonton for 2 years on a scholarship she'd won without telling her father, because she already knew what he would say. When she came home, Douglas put her to work in the family office, partly because she was useful and partly because it kept her close. He never once asked what she thought about anything. That autumn, Douglas Sutcliffe called in a favor. Cornelius Blackwood owed him money. Not much by the standards of men like them, but enough. $14,000, borrowed 6 years earlier when a fire took out the south drying shed, and Cornelius needed cash fast and the banks were being slow about it. Douglas had offered without hesitation. He had waited, patient as a stone, for exactly this kind of moment. "I need that note called in," Douglas told his sons one evening in September, when the birches along the highway had gone yellow and the first cold was coming down off the mountains. "Cornelius doesn't have it liquid right now. I know his books." Preston leaned back in his chair. "So we take the mill?" "No." Douglas set down his glass. "We offer him a trade." The trade was this: Douglas would forgive the debt entirely and extend a line of credit besides if Cornelius would agree to take Meredith on as the mill's bookkeeper for 1 full year. No salary from Cornelius, Douglas would cover it. All Cornelius had to do was let her in the door. It sounded generous. It was not generous. Douglas had been watching Cornelius's ledgers through back channels for months. He knew the mill was carrying a second debt. One Cornelius had not told anyone about, a machinery loan from a supplier in Vancouver that was coming due the following spring. If Meredith got inside the books, Douglas figured she could find the pressure points, feed information back, maybe slow things down enough for Sutcliffe Timber to finally get ahead. He did not tell Meredith any of this. He told her only that she was going to Blackwood Mill, that it was a business arrangement, and that she should be grateful for the opportunity. Meredith looked at her father across the kitchen table. She was 24 years old, and she had learned, over the course of her life, that arguing with Douglas Sutcliffe was like arguing with the river, exhausting, pointless, and wet. She packed a single trunk. She arranged to board with a widow named Mrs. Calloway on Elm Street, 4 blocks from the mill. And on a Tuesday morning in late September, when the air smelled like pine resin and coming frost, she walked through the gates of Blackwood Mill for the first time. The foreman, a broad man named Teddy Wick, stared at her like she'd arrived from the moon. "Mr. Blackwood's expecting you," he said finally, and led her inside. Cornelius Blackwood met her in his office, a square, practical room above the cutting floor, with a window overlooking the river and a desk that had not been dusted in some time. He was 58 years old and looked it, broad through the shoulders, slow in his movements, with the kind of face that had spent too many winters outdoors. His hair was gray at the temples. His hands, when he shook hers, were the hands of a man who had not always sat at a desk. He looked at her the way you might look at a piece of machinery that had arrived without instructions. "Miss Sutcliffe," he said. "Mr. Blackwood," she said. There was a pause. Cornelius glanced at the window, then back at her. "I want to be straight with you. I didn't ask for this arrangement. Your father proposed it, and I agreed because the numbers left me little choice. That doesn't mean I think it'll work." Meredith set her leather satchel on the chair beside her. "That's fair," she said. "I'd rather know where I stand." He seemed slightly startled by that. Most people, in Cornelius's experience, did not say what they meant on the first day. He gestured at the smaller desk in the corner, which had been cleared but not cleaned. "Books are in the cabinet. Payroll runs every second Friday. If you have questions, ask Teddy. He knows the operation better than anyone." "What about you?" she said. "What about me? If I have questions about decisions, pricing, contracts, the machinery loan from Vancouver," she said it plainly, watching his face. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He was quiet for a moment. "How did you know about that?" "I didn't," she said. "Not specifically, but any mill your size, carrying the kind of volume I can see from last year's receivables, has either a machinery debt or a land debt. You own the land. So." Cornelius Blackwood looked at Meredith Sutcliffe for a long moment. Then, for the first time, something shifted in his face. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of reassessment. "You can ask me," he said. "I'll answer what I can." The first month was hard in the way that new things are always hard. The men on the floor didn't know what to make of her. Most of them were polite in that careful, watchful way that people are polite when they haven't yet decided what to think. A few were openly skeptical. One of the older cutters, a man named Roderick Hume, 57, told Teddy Wick within her earshot that a Sutcliffe in Blackwood's books was like a fox in the henhouse. Meredith heard it. She didn't say anything about it to anyone. What she did was work. She came in at 7 every morning, and she stayed until the light went. She learned the mill's rhythms, when the big saw ran hot, when the drying schedules backed up, which suppliers were reliable, and which ones padded their invoices and hoped nobody checked. She found $3,000 in billing errors inside the first 3 weeks. Not fraud, just sloppinesses, accumulated over years because no one had been paying close enough attention. She brought the figures to Cornelius on a Thursday afternoon, written out in a clear hand on 2 pages. He read through them without speaking. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at the river through his window for a while. 3,000, he said. "Yes. In 6 years of books, in the last 2 years, I haven't gone back further yet." He turned back to her. There was something in his expression she couldn't fully read, not quite embarrassment, not quite respect, something in between. "Good work," he said, which from Cornelius Blackwood, she was beginning to understand, was a full speech. She nodded and went back to her desk. "Now, if you'll permit me a moment, I want to speak to you directly, friends. You've been listening to this story, and I wonder sometimes about all the different places a story can travel. This one began on the banks of the Athabasca River in a small Alberta mill town, and somehow it found its way to you. I'd love to know where you are right now." Are you listening from somewhere in Alberta, maybe, where the birches still go yellow in September? From British Columbia with the mountains at your back? Or perhaps you're further east? Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes. Or maybe this voice has carried even further, and you're somewhere altogether different. Wherever you are, I'm glad you're here. If this story is speaking to you, leave a comment below. Tell me where you're listening from, and if you're enjoying it, a like goes a long way. It helps more people find their way to stories like this one. Now, back to Hinton, Alberta, 1953. By November, something had changed between Cornelius and Meredith, though neither of them would have been able to say precisely when it happened. It was not a dramatic thing. It was the accumulation of small moments. The way he started leaving the office door open after she arrived in the mornings, the way she started putting a sextant mug on the corner of her desk when she made tea, in case he came in, the way he began gradually to explain his decisions rather than just announcing them, the way she began to push back, carefully but plainly, when she thought he was wrong. The Vancouver machinery debt was coming due in April. It was $22,000. Not ruinous. Not for a mill doing the kind of volume Blackwood ran, but tight. The equipment had been aging, and Cornelius had been planning to simply refinance, pay it down over 3 more years. Meredith looked at the numbers differently. "You're paying 6% on that loan," she told him one afternoon in early December, when the first real snow had come and the river was running dark and slow. "If you restructure the Eastern timber contracts, the 3 that are up for renewal in January, and negotiate payment terms up front instead of on delivery, you could clear the Vancouver debt entirely by February." Cornelius turned the idea over slowly, the way he turned everything over. He was a man who did not like to be rushed. "The Beaumont contract has been net 60 since 1947, I know. But Beaumont needs your volume. They don't have another supplier within 200 kilometers who can match your grades. You have more leverage than you're using." He was quiet for a moment. "You've talked to Beaumont?" "No, not without your say-so. I just looked at their purchase history." She slid the pages across the desk. "They've never once bought from anyone else. That's not loyalty, that's dependency. You can ask for better terms." Cornelius picked up the pages. He read them the way he always read things she gave him, slowly, completely, without skipping. Then he set them down. "I'll call Beaumont in the morning," he said. Beaumont agreed to the new terms within a week. 2 of the other Eastern contracts followed. By the 3rd week of January, the mill's cash position had shifted so substantially that Teddy Wick, who had been with Cornelius for 19 years and had never once seen the books, noticed it in the way the orders were flowing and asked Cornelius what had changed. "Got a better set of eyes on things," Cornelius said, and didn't elaborate. It was around this time that Preston Sutcliffe came to Hinton. He arrived on a Wednesday, unannounced, in a new car that was too shiny for the mill road, and he sat across from Meredith in the small room off the main office where she worked and looked at her with the particular expression he'd had since childhood. The one that said he expected things to go his way. "Father wants an update," he said. Meredith set down her pen. "An update on what?" "On the Blackwood operation. What you've found. What the vulnerabilities are." She looked at her brother for a moment. She thought about all the things she could say. About the past 3 months, about what she'd actually found in the Blackwood books, about the $3,000 in billing errors and the Beaumont renegotiation, and the way Cornelius Blackwood had looked at her that first morning like she was a piece of machinery without instructions, and the way he looked at her now. "There aren't any," she said. Preston blinked. "What?" "Vulnerabilities. The mill is clean. The books are clean. The debt situation has been resolved. There's nothing for Father to work with." "Meredith." Preston's voice dropped into the register it went when he was trying to sound like Douglas. "You've been in there for 3 months. You have to have found something." "I found $3,000 in billing errors," she said. I corrected them for Mr. Blackwood's benefit. Preston stared at her. You're supposed to be feeding us information. No, she said, quietly and with great precision. Father told me I was going to Blackwood Mill to do bookkeeping. That's what I've been doing. She picked up her pen again. If you'll excuse me, I have payroll to finish. Preston drove back out on the same road he'd come in on, and the shiny car kicked up the same gray mud on the way out as it had on the way in. Meredith sat at her desk for a while after he left. She thought about calling her father. She thought about packing her trunk and going back to Edmonton. She thought about a lot of things. Then she went back to the numbers because the numbers made sense, and right now sense was what she needed. She told Cornelius about it the next morning. She had thought all night about whether to tell him, about whether it was her place, about what it would mean, about whether he would believe her, or whether he would see it as a Sutcliffe trying to get ahead of something that was already falling apart. In the end, she told him because she had decided, somewhere in the past 3 months, that she was not her father's instrument. And the least she could do with that decision was be honest about what it had cost her. She sat across from his desk and told him the whole thing. The original arrangement, what Douglas had expected her to find, what Preston had come to ask for. She told it plainly, without excusing herself and without overdramatizing. When she finished, she folded her hands on the desk and waited. Cornelius Blackwood sat very still for a long time. The river was gray and slow through the window. The big saw was running on the floor below, and the whole building carried its low vibration, the way it always did, the way Meredith had stopped noticing weeks ago. Your father sent you here to get inside my books, Cornelius said finally. Yes, and you didn't. No. Why not? She looked at him steadily. Because I'm not very good at doing things I'm ashamed of. Another long silence. Cornelius looked at the river. He looked at his hands. He looked back at her. I need to think, he said. I know, she said, and she stood up and went back to her desk and did not wait to be told whether she still had a job, because she had already decided that if he sent her home, she would go home without regret, and if he let her stay, she would stay with her whole self. He let her stay. He came to her desk 2 hours later and stood with his hands in his pockets, the way he stood when he was working something out. I'm going to renegotiate the arrangement with your father, he said. I'm going to pay back the original debt on my own terms, which I can do now, and I'm going to offer you a salary, a real one. From the mill, Meredith looked up at him. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, he said it simply. But I don't keep people on under arrangements I don't respect. If you stay as my bookkeeper, not your father's. She was quiet for a moment. What did you tell him? I haven't called him yet. I wanted to ask you first. A pause. Do you want to stay? She thought about Edmonton. She thought about the scholarship and the small boarding house and the ledgers she'd memorized. She thought about the Beaumont contract and the billing errors and the way this man had never once in 3 months talked down to her or around her or over her head. Yes, she said, I want to stay. The call to Douglas Sutcliffe was short and not pleasant. Cornelius made it from his office with the door closed, and afterward he came out looking the way men look when they have said something difficult and know they were right to say it. He didn't tell Meredith what was said, and she didn't ask. She could guess well enough. Douglas did not speak to Meredith directly for 4 months. When he finally did, a brief, stiff conversation at a family gathering in March, he treated her with the specific coldness of a man who has lost and knows it. Preston was worse, in the way that smaller grievances often are. Meredith found that she minded less than she'd expected. Spring came slowly to the Athabasca Valley, the way it always does in Alberta. Grudgingly, in fits and starts, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes first and holding on in the shadow places long after anyone was ready for it. By April, the Vancouver debt was cleared. By May, the mill had taken on 2 new contracts, one in Saskatchewan, one in British Columbia, that Meredith had identified during the winter as underserved markets. Cornelius had been skeptical of the BC contract. He had never done business that far west. Meredith had laid out the figures with the patience she reserved for things she believed in, and eventually he had come around. "You were right about BC," he told her one morning in June, when the river was high and green and the whole valley smelled like growth. "I was," she agreed, without making a thing of it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she had come to recognize, the reassessment, the recalibration, the slow turning over of something new. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the structure of things here, the way decisions get made. What about it?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at his hands. "I've been running this place for 31 years and I've never once had a partner. I always thought I didn't need one." Meredith waited. She had learned with Cornelius Blackwood that the space after a sentence was often where the real sentence lived. "I was wrong about that," he said. "They made it formal in the fall, a business partnership, drawn up by a lawyer from Edmonton who looked slightly bewildered by the arrangement, but wrote it down faithfully. Meredith Sutcliffe, 25 years old, became co-owner of Blackwood Mill. Her name went on the letterhead below his, in the same size type. Teddywick shook her hand the day the papers were signed and said, "Took him long enough," which was the highest compliment Teddy gave anyone. Roderick Hume, the cutter who had said the thing about the fox and the henhouse, said nothing. But he nodded to her one morning in November with the respectful brevity of a man revising an opinion he'd held for a long time, and she counted that as enough. What grew between Cornelius and Meredith in the years that followed was not simple, and it was not fast, and it was not without difficulty. He was 58 and she was 25, and the gap between them was not only years, it was the particular distance between a man who had built everything he had in solitude and a woman who had spent her whole life being underestimated. Crossing that distance took time, but they both had patience, which is perhaps the most useful quality a person can bring to any partnership, business or otherwise. They were married 3 years later, on a Saturday in October, in the same church where Douglas Sutcliffe had sat for years pretending to pray. The birches along the highway had gone yellow again. The river was wide and cold and moving. Cornelius Blackwood, 61, and Meredith Blackwood, 26, stood in front of the Reverend and said what people say when they mean it, which is not always the most elaborate thing. By the time the decade turned, Blackwood Mill had grown to employ over 120 men and had expanded onto 2 new timber leases. The BC contract had become their largest account. They had built a new drying facility, the south one, to replace what fire had taken years before. And it was Meredith who had managed the construction budget, who had found the contractor, who had kept the thing on time and under cost. The Sutcliffe operation had contracted. Not collapsed. Douglas was too stubborn for collapse, but contracted. Preston had driven off 2 major accounts with his particular brand of careless confidence. Harvey had gone to Calgary and gone into real estate. Douglas sat in the same pew on Sundays and looked across the church at his daughter and did not say much of anything, and she looked back at him with the equanimity of a woman who has decided that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. In the town of Hinton, people told the story differently depending on who was telling it. Some said Douglas Sutcliffe had tried to plant a spy inside Blackwood Mill, and it had backfired. Some said a young woman had come to town with nothing but a leather satchel and turned around a struggling operation. Both versions were partly right and partly wrong, the way most stories are. What was true was simpler. A man who had always worked alone learned, in his 58th year, that there were things he couldn't see from where he was standing, and a woman who had spent her whole life being managed and arranged and sent places like a piece of correspondence found in a square practical room above a cutting floor overlooking a river, that the work itself, honest work, clear work, Work that showed in the numbers at the end of the day was its own kind of freedom. The mill stood for many more years after that, long after Cornelius was gone, and long after the industry changed, and the old growth forests gave way to second growth, and the contracts shifted, and the world moved in the direction the world moves. The name on the letterhead stayed Blackwood, which had been hers as much as his, and the south drying shed never burned again, and the river kept running cold and wide and indifferent to everything except its own going. Friends, before I let you go, I want to say something, if you'll allow an old storyteller a moment. I've told you about Cornelius Blackwood, 58 years old and set in his ways, and about Meredith Sutcliffe, 25 years old and sent to Hinton under false pretenses, and about what happened when two people decided to be honest with each other inside a building that was supposed to be a battleground. I've told it because I believe it's worth telling. Because there are still mills and offices and barns and boardrooms where someone is being underestimated right now, and maybe hearing about Meredith will remind them of what honest work can do. If this story stayed with you today, I hope you'll share it. Leave a comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me what struck you. And if you're not yet subscribed to Frontier Roots, now's a good time. There are more stories where this one came from, all of them rooted in the same soil, the land, the work, the people who built something out of nothing in the cold northern places of this continent. God bless you, wherever you are. Keep writing.